Welcome back, everyone. After pushing our way through a difficult and heavy set of topics, where the sources themselves were enough to depress you, we're moving on to a more optimistic time and more beautiful literature. The American West is an incredible place. If you live there, don't take it for granted, and if you've never visited, encourage your parents to take you. The Rockies, the Sierra Nevadas, even the great open empty plains have a majesty and a mystique that is hardly to be matched. And when, historically, we consider it all in the context of one of the periods of great American advancement and expansion, well, it can be easy to get caught up in the excitement. Just ask your parents to play John Denver records and point the car west. Unfortunately, in the midst of all this beauty and inspiration, we'll see no great change has happened in the minds of humanity. If anything, the West and the philosophy of Transcendentalism that we'll see develop makes it easier than ever to follow down the path the Enlightenment started and to put other things in the place of God. We've said in various places that it always gets back to Eden. More often than not, when it comes to human culture and philosophy, humans seem to be in constant rebellion against their Creator. As the 1800s wear on, American society was sadly no different. While the Americans were influenced by the Enlightenment on a large scale later than Europe, that's one reason why the US Revolution was inspired by the Reformation rather than the Enlightenment, they do go through, eventually, a very similar secularization process in the mid to late 1800s. It bears similar fruit in that during that time, many American intellectuals and cultural influencers, especially those in the increasingly liberal Northeast, began to look for meaning and significance in other places than God. We've already discussed at least two places they're looking for it. Some follow the Enlightenment track and seek for it in reason and science. Human knowledge and experimentation is supposed to give us all the answers we'll ever need. But that proves to be a dead and dry sort of existence, a meaning that doesn't really seem to mean anything. In reaction to that, we've said that others began looking for meaning in feeling and emotion, which developed into the Romantic movement. But a meaning devoid of truth proved to be equally empty and worthless. C.S. Lewis said that when you've taken a wrong turning, the person who is first to recognize it and turn back is the most quote-unquote progressive. People who simply dive on ahead and go further into error are only increasing their failure. Sadly, American intellectuals, by and large, take this latter approach and continue to look desperately for meaning and truth in all the places that can never give it to them. As we'll see, American nationalism and the Transcendentalist movements will become two more poor substitutes for the real thing. Historically, the American West and the westward expansion movement is an exciting and controversial topic. Depending on where you learned your previous history, you likely either know it as a series of grand triumphs over hardship by dedicated pioneers, or as the gradual conquest of the territory and cultures of the Native American people. The truth is that it is simply a human story, and both sides are best understood in that light. On the one hand, we should be frank and admit that the process of creating the United States is a tale as old as time, and I don't mean a romance with Beauty and the Beast. It's a story of conquest. But don't let anyone tell you that this means the U.S. is somehow an evil or illegitimate power. The fact is that all existing nations began in conquest, pretty much every single one on the planet currently. Even the Native American tribes that the U.S. conquered the land from had previously conquered their land from someone else. Now, this isn't to give the U.S. or any other country a completely free pass morally. Definite evil was done in the process, and we should call that out. But we should also reject the idea that we should hold the U.S. to an unrealistically high standard that no other nation could reach. There were two main phases of American expansion into the West. In the 1840s and 50s, many Americans moved west across the Rocky Mountains via wagon trails like the famous Oregon Trail, heading to Oregon and California. Ironically, they didn't really attempt to settle in the Great Plains at this point, where my Antonia is set, which is one reason why Antonia happens in the late 1800s. It's part of that second phase we'll mention in a minute. Americans saw that no trees grew on the plains, and so they assumed that nothing else did either. In fact, they called it, quote, the Great American Desert. That was a significant mistake because it turns out that you can grow more crops out there than Americans can eat in a year. So the focus of this first wave was to get to places that seemed familiar to Easterners, where traditional farming methods would work. The real prophet, if you want to call him that, of this generation was a newspaper editor by the name of John L. O'Sullivan. He insisted that, to paraphrase, it was the manifest destiny of the United States to one day overspread the entire North American continent. I'll say that again because it's incredibly important to American history. It was the manifest destiny of the United States to one day overspread the entire North American continent. Taking that apart, what did it mean? Well, if it's manifest, that means that it is plain as the nose on your face. Anyone can see that this is the way it is, and there should be no debate on the question. And if it's destiny, then God wills it, and there is no resisting it. This gave the movement a feeling of power and surety, and more than a few people began to talk about American expansion in almost religious terms. This idea proved to be hugely popular. The Civil War put the movement west on a short hiatus. The country was too busy fighting itself to focus on migration. As the war wound down to a close, Congress passed a very important law in 1862 that would shortly kickstart it once again. This was the Homestead Act. According to this act, any American citizen could have 160 acres of western land for free if they lived on the land and farmed it for a minimum of 5 years. The only stipulation was that you couldn't have served in the Confederate Army. This sparked a massive shift of thousands and thousands of Americans and Europeans into what is now the Western states. Many Northern soldiers returning from the war found that their jobs had been taken while they were away. Well, if they didn't get them back, the simple answer was to take your family and move west. Even if they did get them back, then the person they displaced could also head west. With the boom of cities like Chicago, there was a call for all the food that could be grown, and so farming was a way to make a good living. You didn't even have to be an actual citizen of the United States for this. You had to only intend to become one. That drew immigrants from all over the world, and they poured into the mountains and prairies in search of a new life. Unfortunately, for every action, there was an equal and opposite reaction. That's as true of history as it is of physics. The settlers did not necessarily end up immediately at odds with the Native Americans. In fact, after the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1841, many thousands of pioneers had passed west without violence. But it was only a matter of time. The sheer number of settlers pouring into the land virtually guaranteed conflict, especially after they discovered how productive the plains were after all. We aren't going to be able to go over the Indian Wars blow by blow, but why did things fall out the way they did? The truth is that both sides had some significant advantages going into it. The whites had an advantage in terms of weapons and tactics. They had developed firearms, specifically repeating firearms, and their military tactics, pound for pound, could deal with Indian formations easily twice their size. On the other hand, the Native Americans enjoyed vastly superior numbers, and as individuals, they were amazing fighters. U.S. tactics might be able to deal with large numbers, but they could eventually be overwhelmed, and if the Indians got in close, they often proved to be more than a match for individual soldiers. The Native Americans were hampered by two main characteristics that tipped the balance of power in favor of the whites. First, Native Americans were fragmented into mostly tiny organizations. Each tribe distinguished between themselves and everybody else, and they often hated the other tribes as much as they did the whites. So it was a much more complex thing than to simply say Native American versus white. Further, there was no common language, so many tribes couldn't even communicate with each other. Things are different today. More harmony came along after the whites pushed them onto the reservation system, and they were forced to all learn English. Secondly, though capable of running successful farms, Native American men tended to think of farming as women's work, and they based their society's existence on hunting. Hunting didn't lend itself to stability or development. They did not build up food stores or any kind of industrial base that would allow them to fight a modern war. In fact, pretty much every single gun that the Native Americans used to fight the wars had to come from someone and somewhere else, and that made it virtually impossible to adapt to the changing threats. The wars were relatively brief, but they were often brutal. The truth is that massacres and broken treaties abounded on both sides, and they tended to compound each other. One side would do one thing, and the other would do the next. They'd have to continue to try to one-up each other. Today, it's politically correct to dwell only on those of the U.S. government. The last practical gasp of Native American resistance took place on December 29, 1890 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. After that, no effective resistance could be mounted. As Christians, we might have much to say about this, but as historians, unfortunately, this is the same painful path that all cultures before the United States have followed, and that the U.S. itself will tread one day. War, conquest, and a fall from power. That said, at that time and since, it was very easy to get very excited for all that was happening in the U.S. In addition to westward expansion, a series of technological and industrial advancements were occurring one right after the other. Ranching, farming, and railroads were exploding, and more of this was reaching farther and farther west. The development of mass production and advances in food preservation meant that massive cities began to spread across the continent. Jobs in the cities were plentiful, though not always ideal, and people increasingly stopped worrying about where their next meal would come from. Prices for even luxury goods were falling as wages were rising, and with the railroads, even people in isolated places had access to more things than ever before. The post-war period was a time of the initial spread of electricity, practical refrigeration, phonographs, and cheap available literature. Increasingly, even average Americans had access to things that only the wealthy would have had before, and the wealthy were living in what was called a gilded age of opulence and ease. Much of the literature overly idealized the Wild West and contributed to its idealization in almost real time. That created what you might call the myth of the West as a place of cowboys and gunfights and new beginnings. If you have a stereotype of the West that's something like what I'm describing, this period, along with the 1950s, is really where it probably comes from. Now, the reality could be much different, even if the ideals were connected to that reality. For example, you can think of the stereotype of Westerners as strong and independent. Well, they had to be. Life in the West was anything but easy. In fact, it was as dangerous as it was difficult, and the reason that Westerners were independent was because they had no choice but to be. For example, Western women were inheriting property and voting long before their Eastern counterparts. This wasn't because the West was a utopia for women. In fact, it was often because that life was so hard that many men actually died, leaving behind widows who had no choice but to take care of their families. Independent? Yes, but not particularly fun. But this overly idealized view of the American West contributed to a view of American nationalism that was, like O'Sullivan's Manifest Destiny, virtually religious. There was something powerful and awe-inspiring in the West. Further, the Western ideal of the hard-bitten man and woman who were totally self-sufficient and needed no one, sometimes not even God, was easy for some people to idolize. Americans needed only themselves to make a perfect world, or so they came to think. It's only one step farther to ask who comes first. Does the U.S. follow God, or does God follow the U.S.? It's an important question of priorities. If the former, then the U.S. should be striving to become more like Christ. If the latter, then God is just there to give his stamp of approval to what the U.S. already wants, at least in the views of its citizens. That was the approach of Manifest Destiny. and it was used to justify many acts that are positively anti-Christian and anti-biblical over the course of westward expansion. My Antonia is a story that was inspired by a real immigrant girl Willa Cather had known when she was growing up on the prairie at the end of the 1800s. You'll probably find Cather's writing to be evocative and beautiful, and you'll get a sense for the majesty, power, and independence of the Western experience, not to mention its hardness. There's very much to genuinely admire, from the harsh, expansive environment to the power of friendship to the determination of the immigrants to hang on and make it in the new world. I encourage you to just sit back at points and let yourself be swept away in the vision and adventure of it. Now, what was her purpose in writing this book? Was she intending to create a Western idol that I described on previous slides? Certainly not. While Cather was, of course, taking advantage of a popular topic to write an engaging novel, she certainly wasn't thinking of that. But what she accomplished does give us a sense of what the myth of the West feels like and what makes it so attractive. It's the same feeling that might make some of you decide to cross the Rockies or to stand on the plains just to feel the emptiness yourselves one day. An idol is an idol, but there are many worse things to make into one. If the myth of the West turned Americans toward inward worship almost by accident, the Transcendentalists are going to do it pretty explicitly and on purpose. Transcendentalism was another movement of the time that was seeking for meaning in an increasingly meaningless world. If you recall, though, we said that the Enlightenment stopped short of openly worshiping humans. Instead, they said they worshipped reason and science. Yes, only humans can engage in reason, but in theory, you're still stopping short of full-blown human idolatry. Transcendentalism was influenced by both the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and it openly said that nature itself is divine. Humans, as a product of nature, are therefore themselves also divine. This is a very important distinction because now Americans aren't looking outside themselves to find their meaning and significance, to find God. Now they are looking inside themselves, at themselves. They are trying to treat themselves as some form of God. And so we've crossed the line into a form of literal self-worship. Humans don't need God on this view because humans are God, at least in some shape, form, or fashion. And that makes us totally self-reliant, or at least that's the theory. There are a number of famous transcendentalists out there, many of whom seem to come from the Massachusetts area and somewhat pretentiously use all three names every chance they get, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Ellery Channing, and Caroline Healy Dahl. We'll be taking some time with Henry David Thoreau in his book Walden. Thoreau spent 2 years living an isolated life in a cabin, trying to get close to nature and himself, learning to do things on his own, and trying to find out what it made himself tick. Whatever he found there must not have been as compelling as some think it was, because he decided to return to civilization, and later on he traveled and wrote extensively. As you're reading him, look for those themes of self-sufficiency, divine nature, and the divine in humanity. American, indeed all of Western society, was continuing down its path of self-deification. This idolization of country, culture, and self echoes those themes from all the way back in Eden. We don't need God when we ourselves can become God and do for ourselves all the things that God has promised He must do. And certainly, that would be an attractive idea. I mean, after all, who doesn't like being told that he or she is as good as a god? This is flattery in its highest form and exactly the kind of thing that our fallen, rebellious nature wants to hear. It also led Americans and Westerners to be increasingly optimistic as they headed into the 20th century. Incredibly optimistic. America and Europe, using science and self-reliance, would create a perfect world where there was no war, no crime, no disease, and no suffering. Imagine if you actually believed that was going to happen. And better, you were going to make it happen. It would be really hard not to get excited for the future. And the higher their optimism soared, the further it will have to fall when it comes crashing back down to earth. Unfortunately, reality would intervene. Human knowledge, human wisdom, human science, as amazing as they are, all have limits. They fall well short of being able to replace God. The 20th century will tell that tale, and our next video, and with the benefit of history, we might be able to describe this incredibly optimistic moment as really nothing more than a train heading for a wreck. We can see what's coming, even if they couldn't at the time, and when the wreck comes in the form of 2 world wars, it will be both horrific and spectacular.